We've seen, all of the signs that have been building up for the past, decade really or more, right? But we're seeing living standards really flatline. We're seeing real wages really failing to make any traction for about 6 years now. What do you think are the key priorities that the government should be focusing on in terms of implementation to be able to steer this idea of a lost decade around?
Yeah, so the government, thanks for asking me to join the interview, Heidi. The government has asked the Productivity Commission to look at 5 broad areas. Skills and adaptable workforce is one of them. Dynamic and resilient economy is another. The care economy, which is becoming an increasingly important part of Australia's economy and efficiency in that sector. The transition to net zero, and then, of course, data and digital is another key area for where we're looking for productivity improvements. So those are the 5 areas, and the priority areas that have been identified are in some work that we released last week, and we'll be looking for input from stakeholders and all Australians on those areas for improvement in productivity across the board.
What does the labour market tell you, though, about the dynamics? Because so much reliance has been on to try and get productivity growth from immigration. Does that continue to be an area of importance, do you think, despite, of course, coming with its own challenges, spreading to the likes of the property sector, for example?
Yeah, so we're not looking specifically at migration settings in this inquiry. We have looked at that before, and there has been some reforms put in by government. But it's suffice to say migration settings, and particularly the composition of Australia's skilled migration policies, are a key factor in productivity, but it's one of many factors. The key for Australia in the last decade has been there's no real silver bullet to productivity performance and improving that performance. We put out a report a couple of years ago identifying 71 possible recommendations across 39 areas, and that tells you that, look, there's no single thing you can point to, such as migration or anything else, that would tell you that, oh, well, that's where you need to focus on. It's a range of areas that you need to focus on, and that's what we're looking at in these 5 inquiries.
Alex, as Heidi mentioned there, the Albanese government's been re-elected with an enormous majority, but it didn't go to the election campaigning on reform. So is the political will there to adopt some of these reforms you're talking about, and what are the consequences if they don't?
Well, I'm not going to comment on government policy and the election. We were given this inquiry in December by the government. We've been working away at it. We asked Australians for their ideas in a productivity pitch earlier in the year, and we got more than 500 responses to that. We've called for the submissions recently last week. So we're keen to hear from all Australians about ways in which to improve productivity. We'll do our own analysis and then give an interim reports to government in the middle of the year. And then final reports to government at the end of the year.
You also had some thoughts on generative AI as well and its potential to ignite productivity. It also has the potential to put a lot of people out of work as well. So how do you predict potential outcomes around the use of AI?
Yeah, so, we think Australia is a services-based economy. 80% of GDP is in services, so that's everything except agriculture, mining and manufacturing. 90% of employment is in services, and the promise of AI is in terms of productivity performance, is really in terms of those services sectors. So we think there is a big upside to productivity gains due to AI. The key is to get the regulation settings right, and we're interested in hearing from Australians about those regulatory issues, and also we're also interested in hearing about ways in which access to data can be improved, because data is one of the key inputs into the performance of AI and its improvements over time.
How much have we seen really the masking of this ongoing productivity problem as a result of the good data coming through still from our commodities exports, right? And does that mean the sort of energy transition, clean energy space is low-hanging fruit when it comes to being able to boost productivity?
Well, during COVID, our productivity performance actually increased, and that was a bit of a a measurement issue and a bit of an anomaly. We call it the productivity bubble, as certain industries that had relatively low levels of productivity were shut down and then opened up again. So over that decade that you spoke about, Heidi, there has been this bubble during the middle of COVID, and that might have provided some false sense of security to governments that, well, productivity was increasing and therefore it's not a problem, but actually now it's come back down and it's at the level it was in 2016. So there are industries you can point to that say, you can say, well, productivity might be doing well in those sectors, but overall in Australia it hasn't been a great performance over the last decade.
Well, no, the last 6 decades, according to your report as well. You say productivity's been stagnating now for 60 years. I mean, how did we get here?
Well, it's not quite right, Paul. So what we say is that the last decade has been the worst performance in 60 years. So during the 80s and 90s, actually, Australia's productivity performance was, in terms of growth, was very good. And the concern is over the last decade, it hasn't been that good. And that's due to a lack of reform, and we've recommended reforms, and we'll continue to do so with this latest inquiry and make recommendations to government.
As I think Paul alluded to, a 3-year government term is not exactly conducive to making sometimes unpopular reforms that might only pay dividends decades down the track, right? With that being the reality, do you think there needs to be more focus in garnering support from the private sector, given that corporate leaders and private sector leaders have been most vocal about the need for these reforms?
I don't quite agree with you, Heidi, that the 3-year terms is necessarily an issue. We've had 3-year terms in Australia at the federal level for decades, and we had significant reforms, in terms of floating the dollar, freeing up capital markets, product market reform, labour market reform with 3-year terms. So I'm not sure that's something you can point to as a barrier to reform. I think it's identifying those reforms and then getting the conditions right and implementing them in the right way that is an issue in Australia more recently, and the fact that there's no silver bullets. Productivity gains and securing those gains in an era where services economy dominates it's hard. It's not easy, and that needs to be explained to people and implemented well by government. So those are the challenges that we face. In terms of the private sector, look, productivity growth has got to come from the private sector. And so that's, all businesses across Australia have got to find ways in which to improve their productivity, whether that's by investment or putting workers and capital together in more efficient ways, educating workers on the job, all of those things. Those are the things we're looking at in these inquiries.
How big a role will something like significant tax reform play in the broader productivity picture here?
Well, we've asked for people's input on that, in particular on corporate tax reform. And the reason we're interested in that is because in a dynamic economy, investment is important and capital deepening is important for securing productivity growth. And investment as a share of GDP in Australia has been declining and is at very low levels historically. And one of the key policy levers in improving investment is corporate tax. And so we are looking at that issue quite closely. And so I think it's very important, along with a range of other factors, including the burden of regulation, duplication and overlap and those sorts of issues. But corporate tax reform is a key issue that we're looking at.
Just referring back to Heidi's earlier point about the need for some policy consistency over a long period of time, would it be your hope that your recommendations get accepted by other parties in Australia as well?
We make recommendations to government. That's our job, and we hope that they're implemented by governments. And so whether they're supported by others, we seek broad support across the community, but ultimately we make recommendations to government. And we hope that they're implemented by the government of the day.
It's interesting looking at the global rankings on productivity, and I think last year Australia came in around 13th, which was actually a move up. But if you take a look at the countries that are consistently in the top echelons, the likes of Singapore, Switzerland, for example, are there lessons learned from some of their models, do you think?
It's hard to get general lessons from other OECD countries or indeed countries like Singapore because the economies are so different. So as the Australian economy is very different from those economies. I think the key is to have broad productivity enhancing policies in place, and what those look like across different countries can be very different. And so that's why we're looking at these 5 broad areas. We do take lessons from other countries if there's obvious ones that are available, but some of them are not so obvious and some of them are very country specific. But I think the broad lesson across economies is that you want productivity enhancing policies, things like appropriate regulation, good tax settings, good labour market settings, good product market settings. But there's always lessons to be learned from other countries about what to do and importantly, what not to do in different circumstances.
Alex Robson, really great to have you with us, and best of luck with the rest of those reform recommendations. He's a Deputy Chair at Australia's Productivity Commission. We do have more on Australia Ahead every Tuesday at 10:40am if you're watching here in Sydney, 8:40am if you're watching out of Hong Kong. You can also tune into the Bloomberg Australia podcast, which delves into the biggest stories shaping the country's role in global business. You can find it on Apple, Spotify or Bloomberg.com.